I just flew in from Atlanta, Georgia, and as we were getting ready to land, because of weather conditions, it was a very turbulent and bumpy flight, and whenever I'm caught in a turbulent flight situation, I'm always happy to get on the ground. Now, of course, I don't want to give you the impression that I don't have faith in God in the air as a Baptist preacher. It's simply that I've had more experience with him on the ground. Again, I do want to say how happy I am to be here, and I want to thank you for inviting me. It's always a rich and rewarding experience to take a brief break from the day-to-day demands of our struggle for freedom and human dignity and discuss the issues involved in that struggle with concerned friends of goodwill all over our nation. And I come to you today to discuss this issue that is certainly one of the most important issues facing our nation and facing the world. Now, I want to try to talk very honestly about the civil rights movement and the problems that lie ahead, and I want to talk frankly about what we must do in this period of transition. I've chosen as a subject from which to speak civil rights at the crossroads. And there are a great many observers today who feel that the civil rights movement is not at a crossroad but at an impasse. They cry out in despair, the Negro Revolution is a myth. Negroes are worse off than they were 10 years ago. The white backlash is proof that the marching, the demonstrating, the blood we shed, the sweat and the toil were all in vain. The Negro thrust was too weak. The white resistance was too strong. We have been betrayed and defeated. Now, this is a quotation that I recently read in a national magazine. It is hard to list the grievances still unfilled that make this despair seem all too real. Yet I firmly disagree. When I try to look with perspective at the real historical picture of the last decade, I find that I am helped by the experience of labor when it first embarked on mass organization in the 1930s. There were strikes then curiously different from strikes of today. At present, when workers strike or bargain collectively, they virtually always win. The question is seldom whether they will gain anything. It is rather how much they will gain. But 35 years ago, there were strikes when the outcome was not so certain. Strikes that meant long weeks and months of intense hunger, conflict and physical violence, a press and public opinion that depicted the strike as an insurrection. With the settlement of many of these early strikes, that there was little or nothing added to the pay envelope, little or nothing for job security, and a mountain of debts to pay and harsh memories to forget. Yet there was one thing that was won, one thing that was fought for as indispensable, one thing for which all the pain and sacrifice was justified, namely union recognition. It seems so minuscule a victory that people outside the labor movement scorned it as in fact just another defeat. But to those who understood, union recognition meant the real beginning. Union meant strength, and recognition meant the employer's acknowledgement of that strength. And the two meant the opportunity to fight again for further gains with united and multiplied power. As contract followed contract, the pay envelope fattened, and fringe benefits and job rights grew to the mature work standards of today. All of these started with winning first union recognition. I think the biggest gain Negroes have won is that kind of recognition. We might call it not union recognition, but human recognition. We have far to go. But like the early labor movement, we have learned that the man who will not fight for his rights has no rights, no matter what is written in law or promised by politicians. Labor is respected today. 40 years ago it was despised and grossly abused. Negroes are respected today when only yesterday they were scorned, rebuked, and forgotten. Even more important, Negroes respect themselves today, and no power exists that can return them to servility and passivity. That is why the white backlash will fail. It may hinder us for a time, but it cannot halt us. What else did we win, and what did we not win? What crossroads are we at? With Selma and the Voting Rights Act, one phase of development in the civil rights revolution came to an end. A new phase opened. But few observers realized it or were prepared for its implications. For the vast majority of white Americans, the past decade, the first phase, had been a struggle to give the Negro a degree of decency, not of equality. White American had intended that the Negro should be spared the lash of brutality and coarse degradation, but it had never seriously intended to help him out of poverty, exploitation, or all forms of discrimination. The outraged white citizen had been sincere when he snatched the whips from the Southern sheriffs, but when this was to a degree accomplished, the emotions that had momentarily inflamed him melted away. White Americans left the Negro on the ground and in devastating numbers walked off with the aggressor. It appeared that the white segregationists and the ordinary white citizen had more in common with one another than either had with the Negro. When Negroes looked for the second phase, the realization of equality, they found that many of their white allies had quietly disappeared. The Negroes of America had taken the president, the press, and the pulpit at their word when they spoke in broad terms of freedom and justice. But the absence of brutality and unregenerate evil is not the presence of justice. To stay murder is not the same thing as ordaining brotherhood. The limited program most of white America had was essentially completed. This is where we are now. White America cannot escape the demand for full equality, for economic justice, but it would like to. And the task for Negroes and their white allies is to make the nation as a whole face up squarely to the full program. Negro-white unity was relatively easy to obtain when there was a simple objective of curbing brutality and arrogant humiliation. This brought millions of whites quickly to the side of the Negro, reaching its highest point at Selma. But when the coarse sheriffs were tamed, the day of easy unity ended, and the day of serious unity started. The fact that the old superficial unity has had its day and is over, the fact that ugly slums are still with us, that unemployment is so severe for Negroes it resembles the Depression 30s, And the fact that school integration is sluggish and token after more than a decade all make many question if 10 years of turbulent struggle was worthwhile. Let us see if we gained anything. But first let us see what we set out to gain. It is widely overlooked that the Negro Revolution was begun in the South, was largely conducted only in the South, and projected programs of reform only for the South. We inevitably came up, or we will inevitably come up with a false result as we look at the North, because substantially all of the efforts over the past few years were to support the Southern struggle. The first historic achievement is found in the fact that the movement in the South has profoundly shaken the entire edifice of segregation. This is an accomplishment whose consequences are deeply felt by every Southern Negro in his daily life. It is no longer possible to count the number of establishments that are open to Negroes. The persistence of segregation is not the salient fact of Southern experience. The proliferating areas in which Negroes move freely is a new advancing truth. Prejudice, discrimination, and bigotry have been deeply embedded through all the institutions of Southern life, political, social, and economic. There could be no possibility of life-transforming change anywhere so long as the vast and solid influence of Southern segregation remained unchallenged and unhurt. The 10 years' assault at the root was fundamental to undermining the system. What distinguished this period from all preceding decades was that it constituted the first frontal attack on racism at its heart. The second major advance was the multi-million registration of Negroes to vote in both border and deep Southern states. That is a Negro electorate in the South that is a formidable force. A decade ago, not a single Negro entered the legislative chambers of the South except as a porter or a chauffeur. Today, 11 Negroes are members of the Georgia legislature. The major accomplishment was national legislation. For almost a century, Congress would pass no laws to benefit Negroes. There was no constitution for Negroes. But in a single decade, the marching feet of Negroes and their white allies made Congress march to a new tune. In 1957, the first law was passed. In 1960, the second. In 1964, the third. And in 1965, the fourth. A body of federal law finally gave substance to the Constitution. And though more needs to be done, what was done drove a breach in the solid walls of segregation and let in fresh democratic air and light. The fourth major accomplishment was the Negro's new visibility. 10 years ago, the Negro was almost invisible to the larger society. The facts of his harsh life were unknown to the majority of the people. In a decade, Negroes made an indifferent and unconcerned nation rise from lethargy and recognize his oppression and struggle with their newly aroused conscience. Today, civil rights is a dominating issue in every state, crowding the pages of the press and the daily conversation of white Americans. Negroes made their cause an issue finally to be faced by all Americans because they could no longer escape it by pretending it did not exist. Finally, Negroes raised the question of poverty as a responsibility of government and placed a new challenge before society, that no government is moral or ethical or blameless if it cannot eliminate poverty today with the abundance of resources and techniques we possess. Today, Negroes want above all else to abolish poverty in their lives and in the lives of the white poor. This is the heart of their program. To end humiliation was a start, but to end poverty is a bigger task. It is natural for Negroes to turn to the labor movement because it was the first and pioneer anti-poverty program. It will not be easy to accomplish this program because white America has had cheap victories up to this point. The limited reforms we won have been obtained at bargain rates for the power structure. There are no expenses involved. No taxes are required for Negroes to share lunch counters, libraries, parks, hotels, and other facilities. Even the more substantial reforms, such as voting rights, required neither large monetary or psychological sacrifice. The real cost lies ahead. To enable the Negro to catch up, to repair the damage of centuries of denial and oppression, means appropriations to create jobs and job training. It means the outlay of billions for decent housing and equal education. For this task, the nation is frankly not prepared. Words about achieving equality were and still are easy to express, but to rise to the responsibility of deeds is harder, and this is where the nation is faltering. So I would like to put it this way: the civil rights movement is not at a crossroad. It is white America that has reached the crossroad. It has come a part of the way toward its dream of a democratic society, but now many are resisting its fulfillment and wish to stop short to remain a half democracy. To put it in plain language, many Americans would like to have a nation which is a democracy for white Americans, but simultaneously a dictatorship over black Americans. The attempt to hold on to this hopeless and unjust solution and the resistance to the Negro's demand for genuine rights are creating the tensions of today. White resistance to the necessary next stage of democracy is dividing the nation and creating bitterness and social turmoil. I want to be very clear that I'm not saying we have a pure black against white conflict. Tens of millions of white Americans are sincere allies of Negroes. They are allies not only because they cherish decency and justice. They are allies because they know democracy is indivisible. If it is indeed to some because the color of their skin is different, if it can be denied rather to some because the color of their skin is different, it can be denied to others because they too may be different, whether it be their parents' birthplace, their church, or their station in society. Another reason that Negroes and so many whites are united against reaction is that Negroes are not the only poor in the nation. There are nearly twice as many white poor as Negro, and therefore the struggle against poverty is not involved solely with color or racial discrimination, but with elementary economic justice. I would now like to briefly suggest a program that I believe is a solution for white and Negro, a solution of the American dilemma, racial and economic. Up to now, we have proceeded from a premise that poverty is a consequence of multiple evils: lack of education, restricting job opportunities, poor housing, which stultified home life and suppressed initiative, fragile family relationships, which distorted personality development. The logic of this approach suggested that each of these causes be attacked one by one, hence a housing program to transform living conditions, improved educational facilities to furnish tools for better job opportunities, and family counseling to create better personal adjustments were designed. In combination, these measures were intended to remove the causes of poverty. While none of these remedies in itself is unsound, all have a fatal disadvantage. The programs have never proceeded on a coordinated basis or at similar rates of development. Housing measures fluctuated at the whims of legislative bodies. They have been piecemeal. Educational reforms have been even more sluggish and entangled in bureaucratic stalling and economy-dominated decisions. Family assistance stagnated in neglect, and then suddenly was discovered to be the central issue on the basis of hasty and superficial studies. At no time has a total, coordinated, and fully adequate program been conceived. As a consequence, fragmentary and spasmodic reforms have failed to reach down to the profoundest needs of the poor. In addition to the absence of coordination and sufficiency, the programs of the past all have another common failing. They are indirect. I am now convinced that the simplest approach will prove to be the most revolutionary. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a now widely discussed measure, the guaranteed annual income. We are likely to find that the problems of housing and education, instead of preceding the elimination of poverty, will themselves be affected if poverty is first abolished. The poor are transformed into purchasers, will do a great deal on their own to alter housing decay. Negroes who have a double disability will have a greater effect on discrimination when they have the additional weapon of cash to use in their struggle. There are two indispensable conditions to ensure that the guaranteed annual income operates as a consistently progressive measure. First, it must be pegged to the median income of society, not to the lowest level of income. To guarantee an income at the floor would simply perpetuate welfare standards and freeze into society poverty conditions. Second, the guaranteed income must not be rigid but dynamic. It must automatically increase as the total social income grows. Were it permitted to remain static under growth conditions, the recipients would be suffering a relative decline. If periodic reviews disclose the whole national income has risen, then the guaranteed income would have to be adjusted upward by the same percentage. The contemporary tendency in our society is to base our distribution on scarcity, which has vanished, and to compress our abundance into the overfed mouths of the middle and upper classes until they gag with superfluity. If democracy is to have breadth of meaning, it is necessary to adjust this inequity. It is not only moral, but it is also intelligent. We are wasting and degrading human life by clinging to archaic thinking. The curse of poverty has no justification in our age. It is socially as cruel and blind as the practice of cannibalism at the dawn of civilization, when men ate each other because they had not yet learned to take food from the soil or to consume the abundant animal life around them. The time has come for us to civilize ourselves by the total, direct, and immediate abolition of poverty. And may I say that I have not lost faith in the future. In spite of the problems that I've talked about and the difficulties ahead, I'm absolutely convinced that we are going to achieve our freedom. And we are going to win our freedom because however much America strays away from it, the goal of America is freedom. And abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with the destiny of America. Before the Pilgrim Fathers landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before Jefferson etched across the pages of history the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence, we were here. Before the beautiful words of the Star-Spangled Banner were written, we were here. And for more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored here without wages. They made cotton king. They built the homes of their masters in the midst of the most oppressive and humiliating conditions. And yet out of a bottomless vitality, they continue to grow and develop. And I say this afternoon that if the inexpressible cruelties of slavery couldn't stop us, the opposition that we now face, including the so-called white backlash, will surely fail. We're going to win our freedom because both the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands. And so I can still sing our freedom song, We Shall Overcome. We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We shall overcome because Carlyle is right. No lie can live forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth crushed to earth will rise again. We shall overcome because James Russell Lowell is right. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future. And so with this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mounting of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. Yes, we will be able to speed up the day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics all over this nation, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Thank you.